The night Park Yi-won looked into my eyes and told me I meant nothing to him, I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not even cry, not while he could see me. I simply nodded once, the way a woman nods when she has already survived worse things than cruel words, picked up my coat from the back of the chair where I had hung it 3 years ago, and walked out of the most feared man in Seoul's private study, without saying a single word in my own defense. I closed the door so gently behind me that the sound was barely a whisper. And then I walked down that long marble hallway, the one I had walked 1,000 times, past the photographs of his family, past the Korean ink paintings he had chosen himself, past the small table near the window where I used to leave his evening tea without being asked. I walked past all of it. I did not look back. By the time I reached the front gate, the autumn air had turned sharp and cold, the kind of cold that reminds you that you are completely alone. I stood there for a moment under the pale glow of the security light, and I breathed in and I breathed out. And I made a decision that I had been quietly preparing myself to make for a very long time. I was going to disappear before sunrise, not out of weakness, not out of defeat, out of dignity. Because the one thing I had always promised myself, the one promise I kept even when I broke every other rule I ever set for my own heart, was that I would never beg a man to see my worth. Not in Accra, not in London, and certainly not in Seoul. If Park Yi-won had looked me in my eyes and told me I meant nothing to him, then he had already decided what kind of man he was going to be. And I had already decided, a long time ago, what kind of woman I was going to remain, so I left. And the next morning, when the sun came up over the Han River and the city began to stir, Park Yi-won sat alone at his breakfast table for the first time in 3 years, and everything he believed about me began to fall apart, one devastating truth at a time. But I am getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how we got there. You need to understand who I am, where I came from, and why a quiet Ghanaian woman from Accra ended up standing in the middle of a Korean crime empire. Not as a prisoner, not as a decoration, but as the one person quietly holding the whole thing together from the shadows, while the man at the center of it all never once looked close enough to notice. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Abena Mensah-Asante. I was born on a Tuesday in Accra, Ghana, in the month of July, during a rainstorm that my mother always said was the sky's way of welcoming a stubborn child into the world. She was not wrong about the stubborn part, that much I can admit freely. My mother was a seamstress. My father taught mathematics at a secondary school in our neighborhood until his lungs gave out when I was 17. After that, it was just my mother and me and my younger brother Emmanuel, and the particular kind of quiet desperation that comes from loving people more than you can afford to feed them. I was not a woman who came from wealth or comfort. I came from love and hard work and the kind of pride that does not announce itself but simply refuses to bend. I studied business administration at the University of Ghana. I worked 3 part-time jobs while doing it. I graduated near the top of my class. I was 26 years old before I ever left the African continent, and when I did, I went to London first, thinking London was the place where a woman like me could finally build something solid. London had other ideas. I spent 4 years in London doing administrative work for a logistics company, learning that being the most competent person in any room means very little when the people making the decisions do not look like you and have already decided, before you open your mouth, exactly how much you are worth. I was not bitter about it. I am telling you this so you understand my character, not to complain about my circumstances. I have never been a woman who wastes time being bitter. Bitterness is a luxury for people who have nothing left to do. I always had something left to do. A colleague of mine, a Korean woman named Jae-young, who had become my closest friend during those London years, told me about Seoul. She made it sound like a city that rewarded effort, that respected precision and dedication, that had hunger for people who could navigate between worlds. She was not entirely wrong. I came to Seoul at 30 years old, with a single large suitcase, a business administration degree, intermediate Korean, that I had been quietly studying for a year before I even bought the plane ticket, and the unshakable belief that I was capable of building a life anywhere on this earth, if given half a chance. Seoul gave me more than half a chance. It also gave me Park Yi-won. And I have spent years deciding whether that was a blessing or the most beautiful curse I ever walked into with my eyes open. I did not know who Park Yi-won was when I first came to work in his household. This is the truth, and I need you to believe it, because everything that follows depends on you understanding that I walked into his world with clean eyes and an honest heart. I was 31 when Jae-young connected me with a placement agency that specialized in finding skilled administrative staff for wealthy Korean families, executives, corporate elites. People who needed someone to manage the complicated business of running a complicated life. My Korean was good enough by then, my organizational skills were exceptional, my references from London were impeccable. I was placed with the Park household as a household administrator. That was the job title. What it actually meant was that I managed staff scheduling, vendor relationships, household accounts, personal correspondence, travel arrangements, and approximately 40,000 other small details that kept an enormous, complicated, expensive household from descending into chaos. The household was in a private compound in the hills above Gangnam, not the flashy, neon-lit Gangnam of K-pop music videos, but the quieter, more private Gangnam that wealthy Koreans actually live in, where the walls are high and the gates are guarded and the neighbors never ask questions. My first week, I thought the extreme security was simply because the family was very rich. I had worked for wealthy families in London. Rich people are always afraid of something. By my second week, I began to understand that the fear surrounding the Park compound was of a very different quality. It was the kind of fear that moved outward, not inward. The people who were afraid were not inside the gates. They were outside. People were afraid of Park Yi-won. I learned this slowly in pieces, the way you learn things when you are paying careful attention, but nobody knows you are paying attention. A word here, a dropped conversation there. The way the staff moved when he entered a room, not hurrying because they were busy, but shrinking slightly. Like plants that had learned too many times what happened when they grew in the wrong direction. Park Yi-won was 42 years old when I met him. He was not a large man physically. Average Korean height, lean, always impeccably dressed in dark suits that looked like they had been made specifically for the silence he carried around himself. His face was angular and composed. He had eyes that missed nothing and revealed nothing. He had the particular stillness of a man who had long ago stopped wasting energy on expressions. He ran a private investment holding company. That was the legal surface of it. What ran beneath that surface? The network of gambling operations, the money movement, the territorial agreements. The relationships with men who solved problems that courts could not touch. That was the world that Park Yi-won actually inhabited. That was the world that made people afraid to say his name too loudly. I did not run when I understood what kind of man he was. I have asked myself many times since then whether I should have. But the truth is that, by the time I understood fully, I had already seen something in him that most people never got close enough to see. And once you see a thing like that, a wound that deep, a loneliness that complete, you cannot simply choose to unsee it and walk away with a clean conscience. At least, I could not. Perhaps that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of woman I am. The first time Park Yi-won actually spoke to me, not to give instructions through his deputy, but directly, face to face, was 6 weeks after I began working in his household. I had stayed late one evening reorganizing 3 years of mismanaged household financial records. The previous administrator had been creative with the accounts in ways that were going to cause serious problems if anyone looked too carefully. And I was quietly correcting everything without being asked to do so, simply because it needed to be done and I was the person who had noticed. It was past 11 at night. I did not realize he was still in the building until I heard footsteps on the marble stairs. He stopped in the doorway of the accounting room. I still remember the light from the hallway falling across half his face, leaving the other half in shadow, and he looked at me sitting at that desk, surrounded by ledger files with my reading glasses on and a cold cup of tea beside me. He said in Korean, "What are you still doing here?" I looked up at him over my glasses and I said, calmly, in Korean, fixing what was broken before I arrived. It will take me 2 more nights to complete it. He was quiet for a moment, then he asked, how much is missing? I told him. He did not react the way most men would have reacted, no anger, no visible alarm. He simply nodded once, slowly, as though I had confirmed something he had already suspected, but had not gotten around to addressing. He asked, why are you fixing it instead of reporting it? I said, because reporting it would cause a problem. Fixing it quietly makes the problem disappear. The outcome is better and the noise is less. I assumed you preferred less noise. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, you assumed correctly. And he walked away, that was all. But something shifted after that night. Small things. He began acknowledging my presence when we passed in the household, a slight nod, nothing more. He began routing certain correspondence directly to me instead of through his deputy. He began, very occasionally, appearing in whatever room I was working in at the end of the evening and simply sitting. Not talking, just sitting. At first this made me uncomfortable. I did not know what was expected of me, but I watched him carefully and I came to understand that nothing was expected. He simply needed, sometimes, to be in a room with someone who was not afraid of him, and was not performing for him, and was not trying to gain something from him. He was the loneliest man I had ever been near. Not lonely in the way people are lonely when they have been left alone. Lonely in the way people are lonely when they have been surrounded by the wrong things for so long they have forgot that other things exist. His wife had died 4 years before I arrived. A quiet death, illness, not violence, though the rumors that circulated in Seoul's underworld were less kind than the truth. He had one son, Park Min-jun, who was 17 when I first arrived. A serious, watchful boy who looked like his father, but had inherited something his father had perhaps once possessed and then slowly lost, a kind of openness, a willingness to be seen. It was Min-jun who actually first broke through the formality between his father and me. I remember the exact night. It was a Thursday in January, bitterly cold, the kind of Seoul winter that reminds you the city sits on a latitude where winter is not gentle. I was in my small suite in the east wing of the compound, reading, when I heard a knock at my door that was too hesitant to belong to any of the regular staff. I opened the door to find Park Min-jun standing in the hallway in his school uniform, which meant he had come straight from somewhere directly to my door. His shoes were wet. His face was white. His eyes were red in a way that told me he had been crying for a long time, and had stopped only because he ran out of the ability to continue. He was 17 years old, and he looked, in that moment, about 9. I opened my door wide and said simply, "Come in." He sat on the small sofa in my sitting area, and I made him hot tea the Ghanaian way, which is sweeter and thicker than Korean tea. And I set it in front of him, and I sat across from him, and I waited. He told me, in a mixture of Korean and halting English, that he had been at school when 3 older boys, connected. The kind of connected that had everything to do with his father's enemies, had surrounded him and said things to him. Threatened him, not physically, worse, they had told him specific things about his father, things meant to shame him. Ugly, deliberate, carefully chosen words designed to break a 17-year-old boy. And then one of them had said, "Tell your father we know." He did not know what they knew. But the terror on his face told me that he understood, in his bones, that it was serious. I told him to sleep there that night. I made up the small spare room next to mine, and I told him he was safe, and I meant it with every part of myself. At 2 in the morning, there was a knock on my door, firm, controlled, but with something underneath it that I had never heard before. Park Yi-won stood in my doorway. He had obviously come looking for his son and been told by the night staff where Min-jun was. His composed face was, for the first time since I had known him, not entirely composed. There was something moving behind his eyes that he was working very hard to contain. He said, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward slightly to hear it, "Can my son sleep here tonight?" Such a simple question. Such an enormous thing for a man like him to ask. Because what he was really asking was, is he safe with you? Can I trust you with the most important thing in my life? Will you protect what I cannot protect right now because I am the reason he is in danger? I said, "He is already asleep. He is fine. He is safe. You can check on him yourself." He did. He stood in the doorway of that small spare room for a long time, looking at his sleeping son. Then he came back and he stood in my sitting room and he looked at me, and I looked at him. And something passed between us, in that silence, that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but both of us understood. He said, "Thank you, Abena." It was the first time he had called me by my name. I said, "Get some rest. I will have him ready for school in the morning." He nodded. He left. I sat alone in my sitting room for a long time after that, very still, being very honest with myself about what I was feeling and what I was going to do about it. I decided that I was going to do nothing about it, not because I was afraid. Because I was wise enough to know that the heart does not always deserve what it wants, and sometimes protecting someone matters more than being with them. I made that decision at 2:30 in the morning in January. I kept that decision for 3 years. Let me tell you what nobody in that compound ever fully understood about me. People looked at me and saw a plus-size Ghanaian woman who managed the household. They saw a foreign hire who spoke surprisingly good Korean and kept the accounts in perfect order and was always calm in a crisis. Some of them liked me. Some of them, the ones who were loyal to people who did not want Park Yi-won to be comfortable or safe, watched me with the particular suspicion that outsiders always earn in closed worlds. None of them saw what I was actually doing, and what I was actually doing was this: I was watching. I had spent a lifetime being underestimated. In Accra, in London, in Seoul, people look at a woman who looks like me and they decide before she speaks exactly what category she belongs to. And because they have already decided, they stop watching her. They stop noticing what she sees. They stop wondering what she understands. This is a mistake. I had been inside Park Yi-won's household for 8 months when I first became aware that someone on the inside was leaking information to a rival organization. A man named Choi Byung-soo, who controlled territories in the northern districts and had been looking for a way to destabilize Park's operation for years. I did not come across this because anyone trusted me with sensitive information. I came across it because I managed the household accounts, which meant I saw every payment that moved through the legitimate surface of the operation. And I am very good with numbers. Very good at noticing when patterns change. Very good at understanding what an unusual payment to an unusual vendor at an unusual hour actually means. I noticed. I said nothing to Park Yi-won directly. Not because I did not want to help him, but because I understood his world well enough by then to know that if I walked into his study and said, "I believe one of your trusted associates is selling your movements to Choi Byung-soo," the first question he would ask, the first question anyone in his position would ask, was, "How do you know this? And why should I believe you over a man I have known for 15 years? A foreign woman in his household, pointing fingers at a long-time Korean associate. I knew exactly how that would go. So I gathered evidence quietly. I documented everything I noticed. I cross-referenced payment patterns across 18 months of records. I identified 3 specific payments that could be traced, with careful work, back to accounts connected to Choi's organization. And then I placed that documentation, organized clearly, without any note of authorship, in a sealed folder that I left on the desk of Park Yi-won's most trusted attorney. A man named Attorney Yoon, with a handwritten note that said only, "Please look carefully at pages 7, 14, and 22. The timing matters. I never told anyone I had done this. 6 weeks later, the leaking associate was quietly removed from the organization. I never heard Park Yi-won speak of it. I never expected credit, but that was only the beginning. There is a particular type of loneliness that belongs to the person who protects others from the shadows. You cannot share what you are doing. You cannot explain your choices. You cannot say, "I am tired. I am afraid. I am carrying something very heavy and nobody even knows I am carrying it." You simply carry it. I carried many things during those 3 years. I carried the knowledge that 2 men in Park Yi-won's outer circle were planning to separate Min-jun from his father, not through violence, but through a careful campaign of manipulation designed to turn the son against the father, to use the boy as leverage. I identified this slowly, through conversations I was not meant to hear. Through letters that passed through household channels, in ways that the senders assumed a foreign housekeeper would not notice or understand. I quietly redirected Minjun. I made sure he had reasons to be elsewhere on the evenings when those conversations were being cultivated. I introduced him, subtly, without making it obvious, to people who were good influences, who had no agenda, who could give him the mentorship he needed from sources that were not contaminated. I never told him what I was doing or why. I carried the knowledge of a woman, a journalist, ambitious and intelligent, who had been approached by Choi's people and offered something very valuable in exchange for a damaging story about Park Yi-won, a story built on half-truths and carefully arranged photographs. The story was not entirely false, but it was curated to destroy rather than to illuminate, and if it had been published, it would have created the kind of public pressure that could unravel years of carefully maintained stability. I found out about it because the journalist, researching her story, reached out through intermediaries to several people connected to the Park household. One of those people was a younger domestic staff member who was frightened and came to me without knowing exactly why she trusted me, only knowing that she did. I spent 2 weeks quietly, carefully, through channels that could never be connected back to the Park compound, making sure the journalist understood that the photographs she had been given were manipulated, that the sources she had been directed to were compromised, and that there was a much larger and more truthful story available to her. One about Choi Byung-soo's long history of silencing legitimate press through exactly this kind of manufactured controversy. The damaging story was never published. Choi Byung-soo became the story instead. I told no one. I also bore something more personal. Something I have never spoken aloud to anyone, and am only speaking now, because the telling of it is part of the truth of what happened. I bore the weight of loving a man who did not know how to receive love. Not romantic love in the simple storybook sense, though yes, if I am being completely honest with myself. The feeling that grew in me over those 3 years was something more than professional loyalty and more than simple compassion. It was the kind of feeling that grows when you know someone, truly know them, in all their broken places, and you choose them anyway, every day, quietly, without demanding they acknowledge it. I bore that weight alone. I never acted on it. I never spoke of it. I maintained my professional bearing absolutely. I gave him what he needed, which was the stability, the reliability. The quiet human presence of someone who was not afraid of him and not using him, without ever making him uncomfortable with anything he was not ready to receive. This is what women like me are trained to do from birth, to give without invoice, to love without announcement, to support without requiring the person being supported to even fully understand that support is what they are receiving. I am not saying it is right. I am saying it is what I knew how to do, and I did it with everything I had. For 3 years, until the night someone finally decided I was useful as a target.